We are taught in school that World War I started with 2 bullets fired in Sarajevo. We are told it was a tragic accident of alliances, and that the assassination of an archduke set off a chain reaction that no one wanted. But this is the version of history written for children. It is a lie designed to hide the cold, hard economics of empire. If you truly want to understand why millions of men died in the trenches, and why the map of the Middle East is a disaster zone today, you have to look past the assassination. You have to look at a map of the world in the year 1900 and find the one thing that terrified the British Empire more than any army or navy. It was not a weapon, it was a train line. This is the story of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. It is the story of an iron road that promised to connect the heart of Europe directly to the oil fields of the Middle East, bypassing the British chokehold on global trade. It is the story of how the Ottoman Empire tried to escape the financial slavery of London and Paris, only to walk straight into a trap that would destroy it completely. To understand this tragedy, we must first understand the prison that the world was living in at the turn of the 20th century. The British Empire was the undisputed master of the globe, and its power rested on 2 pillars: the Royal Navy, which controlled every major shipping lane, and the Suez Canal in Egypt. The Suez Canal was the lifeline of the empire. It was the only quick way to reach India, the crown jewel of the British system. As long as Britain controlled Suez, they controlled who could trade with the East. If you were a German merchant or a Russian trader and you wanted to send goods to Asia, you had to pass through British checkpoints. You had to play by British rules. But in the heart of Europe, a new monster was rising. Germany had unified in 1871 and was becoming an industrial titan. Their factories were outproducing British factories, and their science was the envy of the world. But Germany had a problem. They had no empire. They had no massive colonies to provide cheap raw materials, and worst of all, they had no navy that could challenge the British. Germany was a giant trapped in a cage, surrounded by enemies and cut off from global markets by the guns of the British fleet. At the same time, to the southeast, lay the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, the Ottomans had been a superpower. But by the late 19th century, they were known as the sick man of Europe. The empire was rotting from the inside. They had lost territory in the Balkans, their army was outdated, but their biggest problem was debt. The Ottoman government was drowning in loans owed to British and French banks. In 1881, the empire had effectively gone bankrupt. To pay back their creditors, they were forced to surrender control of their own economy to an organization called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This was not a government agency. It was a board of European bankers who literally collected the taxes from Ottoman citizens. If a Turkish farmer sold salt, silk, or tobacco, the tax money did not go to the Sultan. It went directly into a bank vault in London or Paris. The Sultan at the time, Abdul Hamid II, was desperate. He knew that his empire was being eaten alive by foreign capital. He needed a way to modernize his country and defend his borders without relying on the very people who were robbing him. He needed infrastructure. He needed a railway that could move troops from Constantinople to the desert frontiers in days rather than months. But he knew that if he asked the British or French to build it, they would just use it to tighten their grip. This is where the interests of Germany and the Ottoman Empire collided in a perfect storm. The German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, saw an opportunity that would change the balance of power forever. He proposed a radical plan. Germany would build a railway connecting Berlin to Constantinople, and then extend that railway all the way to Baghdad and the Persian Gulf. Think about the geometry of this project. It was a dagger aimed at the British Empire. A train loaded with German steel or chemicals could leave Berlin, travel through Vienna, across the Balkans, enter Turkey, and travel all the way to the Indian Ocean without ever seeing a British ship. It would create a massive overland trade route that the Royal Navy could not touch. It would unite the industrial power of Germany with the resource wealth of the Middle East. For the Sultan, it was a lifeline. For Germany, it was a path to world power. But for Britain, it was a nightmare. Construction began immediately, led by the massive German financial institution, Deutsche Bank. The engineering was a miracle of its time. They blasted tunnels through the Taurus Mountains and laid tracks across scorching deserts. But as the iron rails moved east, panic began to set in London. British strategic planners looked at the map and saw a dagger pointed at the heart of their empire. If the railway was completed, German troops could threaten the Suez Canal, and German merchants could flood the markets of India with cheap goods. However, there was something else buried under the sand that was even more dangerous than trade. Oil. At this exact moment in history, oil was just beginning to replace coal as the fuel of the Navy. The British had discovered that oil burned hotter and cleaner than coal, allowing ships to travel faster and stay at sea longer. Admiral Fisher, the head of the Royal Navy, famously said that the fleet must convert to oil to survive. But there was a problem. Britain had no oil on its own island. Geologists were beginning to realize that the territory of Mesopotamia, which we now call Iraq, was sitting on an ocean of oil, and the Germans had been smart. In their contract with the Sultan, they had secured the mineral rights for 20 kilometers on either side of the railway track. This meant that if the train was finished, Germany would not just control a trade route. They would control the tap that fueled the future of warfare. They would control the very resource the British Navy needed to survive. The British establishment decided that this railway could not be allowed to reach the sea. They used every weapon in their arsenal to stop it. First, they used dirty diplomacy. They pressured the Sheikh of Kuwait, a small territory at the end of the line, to sign a secret agreement with Britain. The Sheikh agreed not to lease any land to foreign powers without British permission. This effectively blocked the railway from having a terminal on the Persian Gulf. It was a strategic checkmate that left the German railway leading to nowhere. Then they turned to psychological warfare. British newspapers began a massive propaganda campaign, calling the Ottomans barbarians and accusing the Germans of supporting tyranny. Finally, they weaponized the city of London. The financial capital of the world refused to allow any British money to invest in the project. They tried to starve the railway of cash. But the Germans kept building. By 1914, the rails had reached the mountains of southern Turkey, and the project was nearly complete. The trap was set. It is in this context that we must view the outbreak of World War I. The tensions between the great powers were not just about national pride or border disputes in Europe. They were about who would control the economic future of the world. The Triple Entente alliance between Britain, France, and Russia was formed specifically to encircle Germany and stop its commercial expansion. When the war started, the Ottoman Empire made a fatal calculation. They joined the fight on the side of Germany, hoping that a German victory would wipe away their crushing debts to British and French banks. They hoped the railway would bring the guns and supplies needed to save their nation. But they had miscalculated the ruthless determination of the British Empire. As soon as the war began, the British military did not just look at Berlin. They looked at the Middle East. A British expeditionary force was immediately sent to Basra in southern Iraq. Their mission was ostensibly to protect an oil refinery, but their real goal was to march north. They were following the exact path of the unfinished railway. They were racing to secure the oil fields of Mosul and Kirkuk before the Germans could get there. While soldiers in Europe died in the mud, soldiers in Mesopotamia died of heat stroke trying to capture a train line. As the war dragged on, the British and French governments met in secret to decide the fate of the Ottoman lands. They didn't even wait for the war to end. In 1916, two diplomats named Mark Sykes and Francois-Georges Picot sat down with a map and a pencil. They drew arbitrary lines across the Middle East that ignored tribal boundaries, religious sects, and geography. But if you look closely at the Sykes-Picot Agreement, you will see something chilling. The lines correspond almost perfectly to the proposed route of the Baghdad Railway and the known locations of oil deposits. Britain claimed the southern part of Iraq and the port of Haifa. France claimed Syria and Lebanon. They were carving up the carcass of the empire to ensure that no single power could ever threaten their dominance again. The railway that was meant to unite the region became the knife that divided it. The betrayal was total. To defeat the Ottomans, the British enlisted the help of the Arab tribes, promising them independence if they revolted. T. Lawrence, known to history as Lawrence of Arabia, led these revolts, blowing up the very railway lines that the Ottomans relied on. But when the war ended, the Arabs did not get their freedom. They got British and French colonial rule. The Ottoman Empire was dissolved, the Sultan was deposed, and the debt was not forgiven. It was merely restructured to be paid by the new nations carved out of the ruins. The British Empire had succeeded. They had stopped the German threat, secured the route to India, and most importantly, seized the oil that would power the 20th century. But they made sure the railway never functioned as it was designed to. The Berlin-Baghdad line was cut into pieces, with different sections now lying in Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. Instead of rebuilding the railway to unite the region's economy, the British focused on building pipelines. Why pipelines? Because pipelines are easier to control. They don't carry passengers, they don't carry ideas, and they don't carry trade between neighbors. They only carry oil out to the west. The Middle East was intentionally kept divided. The colonial powers realized that a fractured region was weak and dependent, whereas a united one could challenge them. The borders they drew created new obstacles. A train traveling from Baghdad to Europe now had to cross 3 different customs borders and deal with 3 different currencies. The dream of a Silk Road of steel was dead, replaced by a reality of extraction. But history is a circle, and the ghost of that railway has returned with a vengeance. Look at the world today. We have a new rising industrial power challenging a dominant naval empire. China is the new Germany. The United States is the new British Empire, and the Belt and Road Initiative? It is the new Berlin-Baghdad Railway. Just like Kaiser Wilhelm a century ago, the Chinese leadership realizes they are vulnerable at sea. The U.S. Navy controls the shipping lanes of the Pacific, just as the Royal Navy controlled the Atlantic. So China is building massive high-speed rail lines and pipelines across the Eurasian continent to bypass American power. If you look at the map of these modern projects, it looks almost exactly like the map of the Baghdad Railway, but on a much larger scale. And just like the British in the 1900s, the Americans are panicking. We hear the same accusations of debt traps and supporting dictators that the British press used against Germany. The language hasn't changed in 100 years because the strategic anxiety is identical. The lesson of the Baghdad Railway is that infrastructure is never neutral. A road is never just a road. It is a vector of power. And the powers that be will burn the world down before they let their rivals control the flow of trade. As we watch the news today and see the endless chaos in the Middle East, remember this. Those borders were not drawn to create nations. They were drawn to stop a train. The train that never arrived is still destroying the world. I am Branny, and this is Empires in Ruin. Subscribe now because empires don't collapse the way people expect. They collapse the way people ignore.